those who wear writhing smiles. I haven't always been afraid of smiles. In fact, like most kids, I used to find comfort in them. Grins from friends and proud smirks from teachers made me feel warm and weightless, like floating on air. I don't mean to be dramatic, really, but I have no idea how else to describe it. Yet of all the smiles I cherished as a child, none shone brighter than my mother. Hers was subtle and lopsided, the right corner of her lip quivering slightly, as if unsure whether to commit. And when she did, it barely rose at all. Somehow, even that slight shift lit up the room with its cold radiance. In my teens, I saw that smile less and less. When I did, it was seldom more than a pale imitation, too wide, too toothy, curling rather than lifting. They were convincing enough for most people nonetheless, and my mother was well liked by everyone we knew. At that age, though, I didn't even understand why she would do such a thing if it wasn't genuine. I recognize now how naive those thoughts were, and a part of me feels bad even if I never voice them out loud. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't miss that feeling of being enveloped by another person's smile, but I suppose that's where this post comes in. In all honesty, there is very little point to it. Everything following this point has happened years ago, and regardless of what you may think of its validity or my own actions, nothing I can do will change it. My therapist recommended that I speak to someone, my wife or a friend, but he doesn't know the full story. No one does, and should the truth ever get out, I can't imagine how they'd react. So here I am, putting my thoughts into words, tossing them into the void, and hoping the echoes are quieter than the screams from which they originated. With all that said, I hope you'll indulge in a little tale. A tale of innocence, of masks, and of drowning. I was 14 when we moved out of my hometown, me, my mother, father, and Hannah. I've read similar stories before, on this site and others. Unlike many of them, though, I didn't mind the move. As a kid, I quickly discovered that my peers found me unsettling. I made the occasional friend, yet none lasted longer than a few months. In the end, they all left because I didn't care enough about them. Of course, I enjoyed their company. I just didn't feel the need to express it, assuming everyone already knew as much without direct confirmation. In that regard, I was very wrong. By 8th grade, most other children ignored me. I wasn't bullied, mind you, just overlooked. So when my father announced we were moving to a town in the middle of nowhere, I felt relief more than dread. That sentiment only grew on the ride there, looking out the window of our beat-up pickup truck and watching as civilization seemed to slip away. My parents never told me the exact reason behind our move outside of the vague response. Your father made some people real mad. It was confusing at the time, but I didn't question it too much. In all honesty, I wasn't shocked that Dad had made enemies. His smile was almost the exact opposite of Mom's. It came easily, stretched taut over his face, and was slick in a way that often got him in trouble. "Hey, short fry, you want to grab me a drink?" he asked as we turned onto our first gravel road. "Bryce, you're driving," my mother said softly, but I was already unbuckled and reaching towards the floorboard opposite to me. "Come on, Ray. It's been a rough few days and we're only, 30 minutes away?" He was right. Our old house was a good 24-hour drive. We'd been on the road for the past 3 days and packing for the last 8. My mother must have relented because she didn't argue. Taking that as a sign to continue, I reached into the blue box and pulled out a lukewarm can. The clink of aluminum and rustle of cardboard woke Hannah, provoking a soft whine. Before buckling back up, I made sure to pat her a few times on the head. Of the 4 of us, the move was hardest on the old Labrador. She had spent her entire life in our previous house, and the past week had left her extremely anxious. I placed the recovered can into my father's outstretched hand and turned back to the window. I watched as houses turned to trees, fields turned to undulating hills, and the blue sky began to darken. The first and only sign of habitation before entering the town proper was a large boulder barely illuminated by failing spotlights. Metal letters were embedded into the rock, spelling out the town's name in all caps, Stillwater. The entire road had been choked by trees on either side, but beyond that sign, they seemed to reach towards each other, determined to tangle and weave together, forever sealing away the place beyond. Despite their efforts, however, we managed to slip through and into a clearing carved from the otherwise oppressive forest. Our new home. We rolled slowly through what must have been Main Street. Even in the middle of town, the buildings were sparse and separated by the occasional tree. We passed by a decaying saloon, a gas station with a single pump, a small church, and several buildings that resembled sheds more than businesses. What little optimism I had following the rusted welcome sign withered as we turned off the main road, descending a surprisingly steep slope. There were several RVs parked precariously where the incline was too harsh. Yet even when we reached flat ground, the only buildings were single-story houses, many as old as the rotting saloon on Main Street. My father pulled into the driveway of one such building, squat and covered in chipping white paint. We didn't move everything inside right away, just the things that wouldn't survive a night in the truck bed or trailer. Even so, I was sweating, sore, and tired by the time we were finished. A glance at my phone had told me it was 11:15 p.m. There was only one last thing to do before heading inside, letting Hannah out to stretch her legs and do her business. I clicked a leash onto her collar and pulled her out of the truck. Back at our old house, she rarely took more than a minute to finish, but in a place like this, strange and new, Hannah was far too on edge. We began by pacing back and forth in front of our new house, staying within the porch light's glow and in view of the kitchen window. When that didn't work, I yielded to the lab's curious nose and allowed her to find a better place to relieve herself. Predictably, if annoyingly, she beelined to the backyard. The idle chatter of my parents in the front room faded, and the darkness seemed to intensify the sounds of the forest. The chirps of birds, the screeching of crickets, and the distant yelps of some other animal. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't content. For a moment I thought, maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all asterisk. That didn't last long. One moment Hannah had her snout to the ground. The next, she stood stiff as a board, hackles raised, and eyes locked on something past the tree line. Her breathing had stopped, and I heard a faint rumbling in her throat. Maybe it's hindsight, but I swear I heard something the moment she tensed. It could have been dismissed as just another creature of the night, but something about it was off. It was continuous, not rhythmic like footsteps. It sounded almost like something being dragged across the forest floor, yet even that wasn't quite right. It pulsed and shifted, left and right, like a snake or worm slithering through the brush. But bigger, much bigger. Almost as if recognizing that I had heard them, the sounds went silent. Hannah, I reached down to comfort her. She bolted. The leash yanked, I lurched forward, then hit the ground, winded. With no time to think, instinct took over. I was back on my feet, chasing after her before I knew what was happening. Hannah, Hannah! Tree limbs whipped across my face, snagging my hair. My foot caught on a wayward root, and I pitched forward once again. This time, when I hit the ground, I didn't stop. There was a sickening weightlessness as I tumbled head over heels and kept on going. 1, 2, 3 times I flipped before slamming to a halt. I lay on my back for a while, trying to catch my breath. There was a faint metallic taste in my mouth and a ringing in my ears. When the daze slowly subsided, I raised my head to look around. My lungs refused to take in air as I realized what was happening. I had been swallowed by the darts. Behind the house, moonlight had provided light, however dim, but here, underneath countless layers of foliage, I couldn't see my own hands. My heart threatened to burst from my ribcage, and when I began to stand, the harsh sting of a twisted ankle greeted me. I needed to get back to the house. For a moment, fresh terror washed over me, * which way is back. Then I hear it, the slight snapping of twigs and the trickle of displaced dirt. Hannah! I hear myself speak without willing my mouth to move. The sounds were slow but erratic. A snap, silence, the squish of soft soil, much closer than before. The shuffling creeped forward, and I began crawling backwards. My hand brushed against something. A deep gouge in the earth, grooves carved by flailing limbs during my fall. Tracing my fingers across it slowly, I realized which way I had come from, opposite of the sounds. The pain in my ankle didn't matter as I turned to run in the general direction of home. I barely took 2 steps before something barreled into my legs from the side. It was hairy, bony, and whimpering. God damn it, Hannah, you gave me a heart attack. She whined and pressed against me, her whole body trembling. I fumbled for the leash in the dark, gripping it tight as I tried to calm my own shaking hands. At the time, her emergence had comforted me. Even now, a part of me wants to believe the thoughts which had soothed my worries. To believe that I had simply gotten turned around, and Hannah had come from the same direction as the shuffling. Either way, the sounds had ceased and been replaced by distant chirps and howls. That was reassurance enough for me. Thankfully, Hannah seemed to know which way we came from, and I followed her lead through the night. Before long, I heard 2 voices crying my name. I returned with a shout of my own, and my father came barreling through the brush like a bat out of hell, nearly causing me to hit the ground for a 3rd time that night. What the actual fuck happened? My father was winded and fighting to breathe. Hannah, she saw something and just took off. So, what, you decided to chase after her? Well, yeah. I didn't have much time to think. Just come on, all right? It's freezing out and your mother's worried sick. He wheezed and placed a hand on my back. I didn't bother bringing up my ankle, but my pronounced limp ensured he would notice. Later that night, after a good deal of scolding from my parents and similar reprimands to Hannah, I found myself collapsing into bed. It was one of 2 bedrooms in the entire house, and for the moment, contained naught but a mattress laid hastily across the floor. In any other circumstance, I may have tossed and turned all night. After my escapades in the forest, however, I began drifting as soon as my head hit the pillow. When I awoke the next day, my body felt as if it had been placed over a washboard and wrung dry. My fall the previous night was bad enough, but the faulty heating in the house had left a miserable chill soaking into my bones. Groaning in pain, I forced myself upright. Licking my cracking lips and stretching my arms high above my head, it took a second for my brain to notice the window. Looking back, I must have seen it in passing the previous afternoon, but I never gave it a second thought. That morning, what caught my eye was the fog. A thin layer of condensation had settled overnight and was obscuring my view. After pulling myself to my feet, I stumbled to the clouded surface and ran my pajama sleeve over it, but it didn't come off. The fog must have been formed on the other side. Odd asterisk, I thought. With the failing heater, I doubted it was warm enough inside to cause much moisture. Even then, it looked strange. Rather than a uniform mist, it seemed to be creeping from some point near the bottom, oddly smudged and streaked. I flipped the flimsy lock and pulled the window open, revealing our backyard and the trees beyond. Despite attempts to reassure myself, a chill ran up my spine that had little to do with the cold. I could see a trail of flattened grasses and broken branches heading deeper into the forest, presumably a result of my father's blind charge through the brush. Robin, get out here. My thoughts were swiftly interrupted by the rough bark of my father. Moaning in frustration, I slid the window shut and slipped into some clothes before emerging into the hallway outside my room. I made my way to the kitchen and was slightly surprised to see the front door wide open. Mom was washing dishes for breakfast, and strangely enough, I could see out the main window clearly. Beyond the glass, a rusted car with a new coat of paint was visible. Hearing my dad outside, his voice mingled with someone unfamiliar, I curiously approached the open doorway. I poked my head through the doorway and saw our visitor. The first thing that stood out about the man was his size. My father wasn't short, but the stranger stood a full foot taller and quite a margin wider. His size didn't pool around his waist, either. It hugged his stomach and arms tightly, bulging but firm. Each movement sent ripples through his whole body, and he looked like he could break me or my father with ease. The stranger wore a dirty black suit and was quick to spot me. "Hey there, little lady, why don't you get out here and say hi?" The man's voice was oddly gentle, and his face, partially obscured by a warped top hat, was similarly soft. His mouth was covered in a long red beard, but the smile beneath reached his eyes, jovial and carefree. "Howdy," I said while stepping outside. The morning sun fell across the neighborhood in a patchwork of shade, the ever-present trees swallowing much of its light. As I walked through a pocket of heat, the house's chill receded. "Robin, this is Mayor Rusk." He stopped by to welcome us to town. Well, that sounds a little too formal, don't it? Not really, I thought, my mind still groggy. Nah, I'm just saying hello. Well, I'm also inviting y'all to church tonight if you lot are up for it. Sorry, sir, but we're not religious, I said offhandedly. I began to continue before feeling Dad's glare digging into my side. Pay the girl no mind, Mayor. We'd love to pay a visit, my father says, clapping a hand over my shoulder and pulling me to his side. It'd be *rude not to. No worries at all, Mr. Bennett, Rusk says with a dismissive wave. You don't have to take part in any ceremonies. There's a few others who are of the same disposition, and you'll soon find we have all types here in our little town. I still recommend you come, however. The church is also our town hall of sorts. Not enough room and not enough money to build one proper. Oh, well, thanks for the introduction, Mayor, Dad responds in kind, but it seems breakfast is almost done. Best help out the wife, or she'll burn her fingertips off. My father's chuckle was small and forced, but Rusk's hearty laughter seemed quite genuine. Well, I hope to see y'all tonight. My father started guiding me back towards the house, but was stopped by a final comment from the mayor. Also, let me know if y'all need someone to look after your hound. The kids around town are always hurtin' for cash, and most of 'em are familiar with the animals. I'm so sorry, did you hear her barking? We'll make sure she keeps it down, FR. My father's usual onslaught of apologies was cut off. Not at all, Mr. Bennett. She's pretty quiet from all I've heard. Nah, I happened to overhear a commotion last night. I felt my father's grip tighten on my shoulder. All that hollerin' had me worried. It's quite a small town, you see, and voices carry. Actually, I brought a little something for the pup. Rusk reached into the pocket of his pants and pulled out a small clear bag. Catch! The dog treats arced towards me, landing gently in my hands. Rusk gave us one final nod of his head and turned to his car. I watched as the little vehicle rumbled to life and disappeared up the road. When he was finally gone, I examined the bag closer. It was about what I expected, a pouch of saran wrapped tied together with a little red ribbon. As I turned the bag over, I noticed something I hadn't before. Tiny words scrawled in black marker stood out against the plastic. For Hannah, soak before feeding.